Who doesn't want to grow more tomatoes? There's nothing like the taste of homegrown, freshly picked from the vine. In this video, I'll reveal the secrets to supercharging your plants, getting better harvests, and I'll take you along every step of the way. I've spent the last year filming every stage of growing tomatoes, from what to do with the little seedlings that pop up to harvesting those glorious fruits. So let's jump straight in. And it all starts with sowing, of course, and the best time to do that is 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. That way they will remain a manageable size right up until it's time to plant. Now, this warm season crop won't tolerate the cold and certainly not frost, so we're going to have to start them off indoors where it's nice and cosy. This year I'm going to sow 3 types to grow both in the greenhouse here and outside. So I've got a cherry type for snacking and salads, paste tomatoes with lots of lovely fine tasting flesh for sauce making, and a great big beef tomato for weighty fruits that'll look the business sliced up on the plate, perhaps with a little mozzarella and some basil. Just delicious. Now I'm just going to use an ordinary all-purpose or multi-purpose potting mix, which I've sieved there or screened to remove any kind of lumps. Pop it in the pot and then lightly press it down to get it nice and level. And now to sow. Now the seeds are big enough that I can handle them individually and sow them across the top without them touching. So just get about an inch or a couple of centimetres between each seed like that. And that way I'm giving them plenty of space to grow before I move them on. And there we have it. And then just cover them over with the tiniest bit more of our potting mix like that. And I'll get them labelled and watered. Do you know what? Sowing like this really gets my heart racing. Maybe I need to get out more, but this is what really excites me. It's the promise of all those magnificently aromatic fruits. It's something to get excited about. The great thing about growing tomatoes is the extraordinary range of varieties we can grow. Now, some are suited to warmer climates or greenhouse growing, while others will do just fine in a cooler, temperate climate like mine. And then there's a decision to make on whether to grow vining or indeterminate types of tomato, or sturdier bush or determinate varieties. And more on all that in a bit. With the growing season still ahead of us to look forward to, there's plenty of time to research what will do best in your situation and intended use. I find that tomatoes germinate a lot quicker than peppers, to which they are closely related. Both need it nice and warm to get going. Something in the region of about 70 Fahrenheit or 21 Celsius is ideal. So for me, I'll be germinating these guys indoors where it's a little bit warmer. To coax things along a bit, you could just put them into a little tray like this with a humidity dome to create a nice kind of steamy, warm environment. But really, if you've just got 1 or 2 pots, then I find it easier simply to put a clear bit of plastic over the top, secure it in place, and then pop this onto a warm and sunny windowsill to germinate. Now, if you can get a little bit of bottom heat under them, then all the better. But really, that's not essential. Any sunny, warm windowsill will do just fine. Once the seedlings are up, keep them in a warm, bright position to grow on. Earlier in the season in late winter, that might mean putting your seedlings under grow lights, but as spring progresses, any bright windowsill will do. That's great for about a week or so, but as they get a little bit bigger, try to move them somewhere that gets more even light from all sides. It'll stop the seedlings leaning to one side, though you can always rotate the pots to keep the seedlings growing more straight. But for me, that means moving my little tomato seedlings out here as soon as possible once it's warm and safe to do so. So I've just made some sowings and I've got these guys here that we're going to plant out shortly. I want to show you the next stage though of what to do with the seedlings. I haven't got any that I've sown, but these guys have cropped up here, popped up from last year. They're volunteer tomatoes that have just come where the tomatoes have sown. So, well, these will do just the job to demonstrate with. Now, I could actually use these. These are of a cherry variety and, well, they'd be just as strong and good as the ones I've sown. So let me show you. So I've got the seedlings out and then I just carefully, really carefully kind of tease them apart like that. And look at that. There's the actual old tomato skin on the bottom. Anyway, then I'm using a little stick or chopstick or whatever to make a hole. Then always handle the seedling by its leaf, never the delicate stem. And then just pop it in and go right up to the lowest leaves like that. Now I've got my pots already pre-filled with potting mix. That means that there's no delay in getting the seedlings into their new homes. There's no risk of them drying out or whatever. And I like to transfer my seedlings like this as soon as possible while they're still very small, as you can see here. They're pretty good at just being transferred while they're young. There's no advantage to letting them get bigger because as they're smaller, they're easier to get into the holes. Now I'm setting these seedlings quite a bit lower, as I said, right up to the lowest leaves. And that's because tomatoes have an amazing ability to produce new roots right the way up the length of their stem. And so by setting them a little bit lower, you're going to get more roots, which will create a stockier, sturdier plant. It also means if you've got really lanky seedlings, you can kind of correct it by setting them lower and getting them back on track. Tomato seedlings are very forgiving like that. Come on, darling, this way. Good girl. There we are. They're all pricked out or transferred into their own pots. The last thing to do is give them a bit of a drink. Now, don't worry, they might look a bit bedraggled, but they'll soon perk up. Now, these can be kept anywhere sheltered from the cold, so a greenhouse, cold frame, plant house, even outdoors in a warm and sheltered spot, so long as they're brought indoors on chilly nights. But now at this time of year, for me, they're absolutely fine out here. I find that tomatoes are surprisingly resilient and will put up with a little bit of chill, but don't push your luck. You definitely don't want them to get frosted. And here are some that I transplanted into their own pots about sort of 4 to 6 weeks ago. And you can see they're coming along really nicely. Just different varieties, hence the different sizes, but they're all growing incredibly fast now it's finally warmed up. It's been a bit cooler out here than inside the house, but I find that the extra light more than compensates for that. Now, if you're not quite ready to plant them into their final positions, then you can just pot them on, and it's very simple. Take the tomato out of its pot, get a bigger pot, and then set it right at the bottom. Now, remember I said that they produce roots all the way along the stem. Well, you can set them again quite deep like this. Just nick off these little seedling leaves. And that'll just help us to create that stockier, sturdier plant. And you can do this at every stage of the potting on or planting out process. Just set your tomatoes nice and deep. However, the rest of them are good to plant, so let's get on and do that now. If you are planting your tomatoes outside, then you'll need to harden them off before planting. That just means getting them used to acclimatizing them to the outdoor conditions. They hate being in a cold, chilly draft, and we need to get them toughened up, ready for the big outdoors. Now, the way to do that is simply on a mild day like today, bring them outside, leave them outside for as long as it's mild, and then bring them inside at night. And then the next day, leave them out for a little bit longer, and so on over the course of around a week. These guys here are going to stay in the greenhouse, so there's no hardening off necessary. And I'm going to be planting 3 types today. I've got a cherry tomato, a paste or plum tomato for sauces, and then a really good general tomato for slicing that's also really blight resistant. Let me show you how I'm going to grow them though. I'm going to plant them into the greenhouse beds here, and I'm going to use this simple string supports here, which I've tied onto a horizontal wire up here. Now this is really, really tough stuff, and that's important because it's got to support the weight of our tomatoes. Now at this point, I should probably explain the difference between indeterminate or vining tomatoes and bush or determinate tomatoes. All of the tomatoes I'm going to grow in the greenhouse are indeterminate or vining tomatoes. That means they don't grow to a predetermined height. They just carry on growing up and up until cold weather ends play later on in the autumn. Now, because they keep on growing, they keep on flowering and producing fruits in a more continuous and steady flow. So you'll always have something to pick once they get started. Now, they do need good supports. In the wild, they just kind of trail along the ground, but by growing them up supports, we'll get a much better crop. I'm going to plant my tomatoes about 45 centimetres or 18 inches apart, and I'm just going to dig a nice hole for them here, pop it out, and then I'm going to thread the string underneath the root ball, so that's going to get planted as well. There we go, that just secures it in place. Pop that in, and then remember to feed it in so we're burying some of the stem as well, so we get another chance of creating that really strong plant. Now, you might notice I've got some salad leaves in front here. They won't interfere, they'll grow nice and low. They're only going to be in here for another kind of 6 weeks or so, and this will grow up, so they're not going to get in each other's way. Now, I should tell you how I prepared the soil here. I just added some really well rotted manure, in fact, at the end of winter. Just dumped it on and spread it out to about an inch and a half or 3 to 5 centimetres deep. And then that's done the job. Now, if you haven't had a chance to spread organic matter yet onto your soil, don't worry, just get it on now and just make sure it's well rotted. Garden compost would be ideal, and that'll just give a really good strong basis to start fueling that growth. Now, I've also had really great fun growing tomatoes in straw bales. It was like alchemy, transforming a crispy dry bale into the perfect raised bed, and that had all sorts of fruiting crops in it. So if you'd like to see that video too, I'll also link to that one. Another option is hanging baskets, of course. Now, they dry out really quickly, so you'll need to watch them really carefully. You can mix in water retaining gel to hang on to moisture for longer, or pop a saucer into the bottom of the basket to help trap some of that excess water. However, if you're in a very hot, dry or windy climate, they may be more effort than they're worth, and you may want to avoid them. Staking or supporting plants is essential. It keeps plants upright, making the best use of space. It'll dramatically reduce the chances of diseases or fruits rotting on damp ground. There'll be fewer pests, and looking after the plants is so much easier because everything's elevated and you can see what you're up to as you tend your crop. I'm using string supports in here because, well, it's very convenient and they're very quick to set up. But like I've said, just make sure it's nice and strong. Outside, you could use strong posts or battens. You could also use bamboo canes, but do be mindful that plants can get really heavy under the weight of fruit, so there's a risk of them snapping, so proceed with caution. Whatever you're using, definitely tie your plants in at regular intervals right the way along the length of the stem. This reduces the risk of any weak spots and plants snapping under the weight. Another option is a tomato cage, and I've made this one very simply using stock fencing or cattle fencing you could use, and I've just cut it down to the right width and then use the ends of the wire to weave it all together. Now, I've given myself a final diameter of around 18 to 24 inches, which is 45 to 60 centimetres. That should support your plants nicely. And then to help pin it to the ground, I've weaved in these lovely uprights of hazel, just woven them in and out, and then got them protruding at the ground, so I'll stab these into the ground once we're done. But first, we need to plant. And for that, I'm going to use an outdoor tomato that also happens to be blight resistant. And that's really important because my tomatoes always get clobbered with blight out here. So this way I'll get something even when it does strike. But before I plant, come here, I've got something pretty interesting to show you. What we've got here are grafted plants. You can see that the bottom is different from the top. Well, the bottom is a really vigorous rootstock. It confers a lot of energy and growth and vim to the variety which has been joined onto it. We've essentially got two plants in one. I've got a really strong, powerful plant here. It's kind of like the high-performance supercar of the plant world. I'm not into my fast cars, but I am into my fast plants. They're a little bit more expensive, but the extra energy you'll get and the bigger harvest makes it well worth it. Tomato cages are perfect for growing determinate or bush tomatoes, and these types of tomatoes are ideal for those people just starting out. Now, unlike indeterminate tomatoes, determinate ones have a predetermined height that they grow to, hence the name. Now, because of that, they make much more compact plants and are a lot easier to look after. They grow to a height of maybe 3 foot maximum, which is about 1 metre, so kind of waist height. And that means they need less in the way of support. Because they grow to a predetermined height, they naturally bush out, so they don't need any pruning. You just plant them and leave them to do their thing. This makes them more manageable and ideal for gardeners with a limited space. Determinate plants also tend to produce their fruits in more of a concentrated period all at once. This is great if you want a sudden glut of fruits that you can then process in a batch, for example, to make sauces. I should just add that with these grafted plants here, I'm taking great care not to cover the union where they're joined, otherwise the variety might root and then that will override the rootstock, and we don't want that. I reckon these tomato cages don't look too bad actually, and you can buy these of course, but this is a lot cheaper and you know, a fraction of the price, and they do the job just as well. Now it will work really well because it'll hem the plant in as it grows, so if it did flop to one side then it's nicely supported here by the walls of our cage. There we are. With their demand for a warm, sunny position and well-drained soil met, you can bet your bottom tomato that they'll soon rapidly grow. Now, from experience, I can find that recent transplants can sometimes sulk. The leaves may roll up and the leaves can even turn purple in colour when it's a little bit chilly. But as soon as it's a little bit balmier, well, they'll be off. Recently planted tomatoes, you need a really thorough soaking to settle them in. Then as they start to grow on, well, it's important to keep them well watered. What we're aiming for here is consistency. So when it starts to get dry, just stick a finger into the soil 1 inch or 2 deep and check how moist it is. If it's dry, give it a really good soaking. Don't just wet the surface, really puddle it in so the water gets down nice and deep. Once plants begin to flower, I will start feeding them with an organic liquid tomato feed, applied according to the instructions, and I'll water it at the base of the plant to avoid wetting the leaves. So these are my indeterminate or vining tomatoes, and we're only a couple of weeks into summer, and look, they've already put on so much growth, working their way up their strings, but they now need a little bit of attention. The first thing we need to do is just ravel these around the string so they hug it nice and tightly to help them stay upright. Just weave them around like this, and that's it, job done. So I'm just weaving in one direction, this is clockwise, and the idea is that it kind of sits in the string and then it holds it up. Now obviously, if I'm growing tomatoes against a cane or a stake, then use some sort of ties, so raffia, some old bits of shirt cut into strips for example, or just some twine, and tie them in at regular intervals. Now I'll just need to keep on coming back and just twining them together like this every kind of week or so as they grow up. Now what about pruning? It can feel like a very complicated subject, but really it is very simple. So let me show you how I do that. The first job is to remove any side shoots or suckers, they're also called. And these form in between the main stem here and the leaf that comes off in the axils, kind of like the armpits of the tomato, if you like. So just remove them by just picking them off between your finger and thumb like that. Couldn't be easier. And there's another one there to remove here. And just go through every couple of days and just pinch off any you find. You see there, main stem, leaf, and that's growing in the side, come out like that. It's worth side shooting every few days because if you miss them, they can get really big like this. And when they get to this size, it's a little bit risky pinching them off. So just use a sharp knife or some scissors or pruners just to cut it away like this so you're not damaging the stem potentially. Removing side shoots or suckers keeps vining tomatoes neat and tidy, and because you're removing excess foliage, it will also improve airflow, which will help to reduce the risk of diseases, and more on that shortly. Now, if you're in a really warm climate, then you're probably growing your tomatoes outside, and they'll put on such good growth that you may not find this side shooting at all necessary. They'll fruit well without doing that. Determinate or bush tomatoes need little to no pruning because they grow to a set predetermined size. Now, these guys will flower and then produce their fruits all at once, effectively stopping them growing and reducing the need for removing any more foliage, and all that foliage will power that fruit production. These guys essentially prune themselves because once they've started fruiting, they'll stop growing. The only other thing I like to do for both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes is to remove the lowest leaves closest to the soil. Now, that's because I don't want the soil splashing back up onto the leaves when I come to water them. That, with all the congestion down there, could be a recipe for disease. By removing the lowest leaves, I'm going to have a nice clear stem here, which will help to improve that all-important airflow. Once your tomatoes reach the top of your supports, you need to pinch out the very top of the growth like that. Now, what this will do is concentrate all of the plant's energy into ripening the fruits that it is already forming there. And it also stops it getting too top heavy and kind of snapping under the weight potentially. However your tomatoes are growing, make sure that if you haven't pinched them out, you do so at least 1 month before your expected first frost date to give plants enough time to finish ripening the fruits. Tomatoes are technically self-pollinating, which is great news when there are fewer bees about because you're growing them in a greenhouse or tunnel. However, the pollination rate really improves with the presence of bumblebees, so do all you can to encourage them in. For example, leaving doors and windows nice and open and planting other cheering flowers to attract them in, like French marigolds, which are the perfect companion to tomatoes because these guys also attract in pest predators. Opening windows and doors will also help to moderate temperatures on really hot days, and very hot temperatures can be another reason behind poor pollination. If you're in a really hot climate, then greenhouse shading will certainly help, as will keeping your plants beautifully watered and mulching them too to lock in that moisture. One of the easiest ways to ensure better pollination is to mimic the low rumblings of the bumblebee, and a simple way to do that is just to twang on your string supports like this, and that'll kind of vibrate the flowers to loosen the pollen and ensure that pollination. If you have bamboo canes, and just tippity tap those instead, or if you're really keen, use an electric toothbrush. Just kind of turn it on and rest it on the back of trusses of flowers like that. And that will really vibrate those flowers like a bumblebee would to loosen the pollen and get that pollination that we're after. Bathed in warm sunshine, your plants will quickly get going and get growing. Now, at this stage, they need between 1 to 2 inches or up to 5 centimetres of water every week. How much exactly depends on where you're growing them, what stage of growth they're at, and of course the weather. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to keep the soil consistently moist but never waterlogged. If in doubt, just do the ever-dependable finger test. Thrust a finger 1 inch or so into the soil and just feel how moist it is. If it's dry, get on and water. And I prefer to use a watering can fitted with a rose so I'm not blasting the soil away from the root zone. A fantastically low maintenance way to keep soil more consistently moist is to use something like these clay pot oyers. They're just clay pots with the bottom sealed off and then the water seeps out through them. They're really easy to make and deploy, very satisfying. And I'll link to a video on how to do that down below. Tomato leaves can often curl up in hot weather. That's perfectly normal, but if they're wilted early in the morning after the cool of the night, well, it's a good sign that your plants probably need a good water. Now, the important thing is to aim for consistency to ensure steady growth isn't stalled. Erratic watering can lead to problems like fruit split, where the water suddenly rushes into the plant after a dry spell, causing the flesh to swell and then the skin can't quite cope and it splits. And inconsistent watering can also encourage blossom end rot, and we don't want that. I like to mulch around plants to conserve moisture and create a steadier, more predictable environment at the root zone. This also helps to suppress weeds while stopping soil from splashing back up onto the lowest leaves, which can up the risk of disease. Now, grass clippings are great, they're readily available, but I've also used straw to great effect and it looks really beautiful too. Once my plants come into flower, it's time to break out the liquid tomato feed. Good nutrition not only supports healthy plant growth, it also results in better tasting fruits too. Any tomato feed will do the job. This will have a good balance of nutrients as well as micronutrients that are well suited to our tomatoes. Having said that, a thrifty, money-saving tip is to use the power of nature to make your own liquid feed using comfrey leaves, and it's really easy to do. Just stuff your leaves into a bucket, then fill the bucket with water, ideally rainwater. Cover and then leave the whole thing to stew and seep away for up to a month. The resulting potent brew can then be diluted up to about 1 part to 10 parts water and then splashed around your tomatoes to give them a natural lift. As I said, whenever you water, just try to keep the foliage as dry as possible. Wet leaves are a big entry point for diseases like late blight or tomato blight, a disease I can only describe as infamous. It can collapse your plants catastrophically within a matter of days. Now, proper spacing of your plants, keeping your plants dry, like drying in between your toes after a shower, and choosing blight-resistant varieties can all help you to dodge this fungal foe. I've chosen a blight-resistant variety for my outdoor tomatoes. They get wet more often, and of course you can't stop it from raining. You'll also get spores blowing in on the wind outside, so it pays to go belts and braces and choose blight-resistant. Tomato hornworms are a big nuisance for North American gardeners. These hungry caterpillars feed on the foliage and can thereby weaken plants. So remove any you find and come across and just add them to the compost heap where they can't cause any more problems to your tomatoes. Don't worry, they can't sting or bite, so hand picking them is perfectly safe. If you have a mega problem with hornworms, then consider investing in a UV light, which makes them very easy to spot. Borage is also said to deter tomato hornworms, so it's worth growing some of these near your plants. And as an added bonus, this flower is incredibly attractive to big bumbling bumblebees, so you're getting a double whammy of goodness from this beautiful bloomer. Sap-sucking whitefly can sometimes rear their unwanted heads in enclosed environments like a greenhouse or tunnel. Now, growing a flower that attracts their predators like these French marigolds here can really help. These are great for hoverflies, which will feed on the whitefly. If you do get a bit of a problem, then just disturb the leaves to get the whitefly up into the air and then just suck them out of the air every few days using a handheld vacuum cleaner. If that seems a bit cruel, then another option in an enclosed environment is to hang up biological controls. For example, of the tiny parasitic wasp Encarsia formosa, which will lay their eggs and feast on the whitefly, though I'm not sure which is crueler. Relish the unbridled joy of just picked tomatoes, something that is achingly elusive from shop-bought tomatoes. Pick fruits only once they are fully ripe for the very best flavour and texture. You can often smell the aroma coming off the sun-ripened tomatoes, and picking or cutting them free, well, it's nothing short of exhilarating. And try to pick your fruits as close to eating them as you can. That's so good. Now, if you do need to pick in advance, then just keep your tomatoes on the countertop where their flavour will stay intact, much better than putting them in the fridge. But if you need to put them in the fridge to last even longer, well, they'll store there for up to a week quite well, but just remove them from the fridge and bring them back up to room temperature before eating to allow all those complex flavours and aromas to recover. If you do find you're struggling to get your tomatoes over the finishing line, well, don't worry, there are loads of great recipes for green tomatoes, my favourite being fried green tomatoes, just divine. In the meantime, do treasure your tremendous tomatoes, and I will catch you next time.